And welcome back to the channel. I'm Claire Headley, your host for today. This is my next episode of Life After Scientology, and I have the honor of interviewing Mr. Jon Atack. Welcome back, Jon.
Hi, Claire. Good to see you again.
Great to have you back. And today, I appreciate you being willing to do this. We are going to delve deep into Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, your amazing book that I think is a critical piece of anyone's recovery from Scientology. I hope you would agree with that statement by me.
Well, that's what it was written for. When I wrote it, I really wasn't thinking about anybody other than people who'd been harmed by Scientology or affected by Scientology. And it meant that the writing of it was very careful. In fact, Stacey Young, who did the Dead Agent, the attack on Ben Corridan's book, when she read it, said she couldn't find anything in it to take apart. So I'd become aware of how they will pick at things.
Yes.
And it needed to be reliable. And apart from a couple of tiny things, like there is actually an attribution to the 30th of February, which only one person has ever commented on. And I invented the word undoubtedly.
Oh, there you go.
So, but apart from that, and so yes, it's intended to be to kind of unpick some of the nonsense that Hubbard, blurted into our heads.
Yes. Yes. And so getting into the timeline, you got into Scientology in 1974 as in your late teens, correct?
I was 19, and I think it was the 11th of December. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. You, like me, have a mind that's clearly set on dates, to be precise.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? I think you're the only other person I've met who has this thing about, oh, what was the exact moment this happened? And
yes,
having done all of that date locating in Scientology, you'd have thought these people would be good at it, but they aren't.
no. Well, we'll get into that, but I think when you start to blur facts and disregard facts to get along and toe the line, then a lot of things can get warped in perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when you use a system that actually induces false memories and teaches you how to invent things, then that can really mess with people's ability to remember things properly. And for me, part of it is that I did deliberately reconstruct my memory towards the end of my time in Scientology and having left Scientology, because I'd been led to believe that my memory was in some way damaged while I was in Scientology, and I came to realize it was probably a little bit better than most people's, in fact. But
yeah,
and there might be something a bit autistic about the dates. I don't know that in my case.
Probably in my case too. Who knows? Okay, so 1974 to 1983, and I found it interesting again that your path out was through the independent Scientologist movement. Mine was not. And I think that a big difference there from my perspective is simply that I was born into Scientology. So it was never a choice for me personally. And I've always been of the view that when it became a choice, i.e. after I had been declared a suppressive person and I was never going to be afforded the opportunity to speak to my family ever again anyway, then the burden of having to, remain in the belief system because of the leverage they had over me, they had already, burned that. So it became my own personal choice, at which point I was done and walked away. But I've seen many people, and I'd love to get your comment on this, who, when they leave, they have in their mind, it seems to me that they've couched it in such a way that, well, they're no longer part of the organization, but they still believe in Hubbard's writings. So before I ask you your views on this, my view on this is that has a lot to do with the deep programming and language associated with Scientology, because if they no longer believe, then they're a suppressive person, or there's all these labels that go along with that, or there's all these reasons that Scientology and Hubbard specifically manufactured that explain that very often keep people in for much longer. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it fits into the general pattern of the way we behave as human beings. It's not exclusive in any way to Scientology. So the way that you trap somebody into something is you make them feel guilty and you make them feel frightened. And so the induction of guilt, the induction of phobia. And with any and every authoritarian control group, and I personally don't think the word cult is pejorative. It just means a group of people that idolize a leader or a doctrine. But we are careful with the C word. But so with any authoritarian sect, you'll find that there is the fear of what will happen to you when you leave, that you will decline. In many of the pseudo-Christian sects, the idea is that, hey, you'll go to hell, you'll be damned. Now, the Moonies go one much better than this. Not only will you be damned, but all of your ancestors will be damned. And that gets kind of complicated when you realize that we have common ancestors. So I don't know how far back that's meant to go. But then you have groups where people are told that they'll suffer accidents. I have a friend of mine, Christian Sherko, who's a brilliant counselor. And he had a case where she'd left the building where the group was, but she didn't dare cross the road because she was sure that she'd be hit by a car.
Wow.
So you have these mechanisms functioning. And then, as you say, you have the loaded language, the language trap, whereby, and Hubbard's very carefully done this thing, it's about the words, it's not about the context of the words. So conceptual understanding is, who knows what that is in Scientology? You're meant to just understand what the words mean. And he then gives you 2 600-page dictionaries of definitions, which are often contradictory. So if you look up Q&A, for example, and in a Hubbard thing, you've got these various different meanings of it. And sometimes it becomes preposterous. So, for example, a tiger is a failed staff member, and Hubbard said it's a tough universe and only the tigers survive. So, and that could be true.
Right.
And we become locked inside the concepts that are underneath the words, and people will often then brush the word off the top. So they'll stop saying dev T or something like that. Which is the one that people often hold on to, curiously, of the thousands.
Yeah, no, I still honestly have not found a good substitute for that word.
Yeah, I was doing
developed traffic, because it's such a broad, it covers so many things in one bucket that it's hard to find an equivalent in the real world language.
Yeah, we'll do a show about that sometime.
Okay.
But it is that one is 2015. I met Nancy Manny, and she said there is just this one word I can't get rid of, and I said dev T, and she went, "How did you know that?" Yeah, there are alternatives, but we won't get into that because I can't think of them offhand.
That's okay.
But yeah, messing about, and nonsense stuff that's a waste of time wasting. There are all sorts of things that go around it, developed unnecessary traffic. And you can actually develop it further to the dev OT.
Oh, yeah.
So the devotees of Scientology developed unnecessary operating thetans, or devotees. It can be used in different ways. And there's a whole construction of thought. I'm working on a book at the moment, which is based on the premise that absurd beliefs can lead to atrocious behaviors. And looking at one set of ideas after another, if you start to believe these things, then it becomes inevitable that you will behave in certain ways. And in Scientology, a good example, my late dear friend Shona Foxness came to me many years ago, and she said, why are you wasting your time doing all of this stuff with Scientologists? They pulled it in.
Mm.
And I'm kind of, that was a bit more slightly Irish inflected there. That wasn't very good. But they pulled it in. And I kind of looked at her and said, Shona, so if a 4-year-old's just about to go underneath the bus, you're not going to stop them because they pulled it in. This idea of karma, vipaka, action, reaction, that we're all caught up in this thing, that we're suffering the consequences of our past actions, which is an absurd nonsense. It's not possible for a universe with, even if if the only living things in the universe were the things on this planet, let alone the other 100 billion galaxies or what have you, then every time a giant clam gives birth, it has 2 billion little babies. And the idea that there's somebody writing down the karma of all of these things and making sure that that the right moment arrives for 417 people to die in an air crash, the mathematics just becomes impossible. But it's a great way of controlling people, of saying everything that happens to you is your fault. And it's because you've been bad that bad things happen. And it's so much a part of our culture since Christian Science, which is where Hubbard got it from, and it becomes the secret, the law of attraction. They're all prosperity Christianity, this idea that you can somehow control reality from this little node of being. If there are 8 billion of us just as humans doing that, let alone the other species, it all becomes so incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
But you can make people feel guilty and you can make them feel frightened. And so, I mean, it is fair to say, Conway and Siegelman, who wrote an excellent article called Information Disease, which was the first thing that I ever read about thought reform, mind control, many, many years ago, that they also wrote a book called Snapping. And in it, they say that Scientology may have the most debilitating set of rituals of any cult in America. And they wrote that in 1990. Here we are with the dates again. And in 2014, I wrote something for Tony Ortega saying, I don't think they interviewed enough people. And Tony, being Tony, of course, published this to embarrass me. He's a good friend. And wrote to Conway and Siegelman, and they said, no, we interviewed 33 Scientologists, so we got some idea. So I wrote to them. I was in touch with them for the first time and said, you said that you think that with the Krishnas or the Moonies, it takes 3 to 6 months before somebody recovers. But with Scientology, you reckon it takes 12.5 years without assistance. And I said, you've had time to think about it now. Would you agree with me that most people, having left Scientology without assistance, won't recover? And they agreed with me.
Yeah, I completely agree with that as well. I do.
It's just so invasive. And there's nothing else quite like it. You come to have a completely different internal reality to any of the people around you. You're viewing the world in terms of suppressive persons and engrams and goals, problems, masses and locks and secondaries, and just this huge vocabulary of material that is fanciful and fabulized.
And in my case, and I think anyone born into Scientology would agree with this, I learned the language of Scientology concurrent to learning the English language. So for all intents and purposes, it was a first language, even without the context. So, some of my earliest memories included statements like, stop being banky. I had no idea what the derivation, I'd never read Dianetics. I'd never even knew what the reactive bank was, but I came to understand as a 4-year-old child what banky meant. Yeah.
A few years ago, I wrote something for Tony Ortega and had a remarkable email from, and I don't remember who it was, but somebody ex-Scientology kids. And I'd said something about the sloganeering in Scientology and the way that you have all of these thought-terminating cliches, these ways of make it go right, all of this kind of stuff, and that many of them are negative. And within days, they talked to their various members, and I think they sent me a list of 350 put downs from the Scientology literature. And I looked at
I
this and
saw that. I remember that.
Yeah. And the next week, I think they'd added another 100. It just kept on going. And it was a remarkable piece of work, and something that really should be published and republished, because how absolutely horrible, all of these ways of undermining people and controlling them. And of course, Hubbard isn't shy about this. He admits that Scientology is a way of controlling people. He admits it again and again and again. You want to have 8C, you want to have infinite control. And when you do the upper indoctrination training routines, lovely use of the word there,
right,
which were actually written by L. Ron Hubbard Jr. And the word junior was Tipp-X'd out after he left. And he says that what happened was they were doing one of their advanced clinical courses in the 50s. And his dad said, we've got rowdy students. We've got to work out ways of controlling them. And he came up with the upper indoctrination training routines, where you learn how to show another person that you can control their reactive mind, so they might be able to control it.
right.
But you move into this step without thinking about it, where, these days in our society, to grab hold of somebody and move them physically is no longer considered polite.
Right.
But
and make them do something regardless of whether they want to or not. Yeah. Enforcing compliance, etc. Yeah, totally.
And you're teaching both sides of it, because you're teaching how to control somebody, but you're also teaching the person how to submit.
Correct.
How to give in. And so you get this whole bizarre thing, this idea that staring at people will make them feel more comfortable in some way. It's like, it's the police and the military use this technique to control people. It's a dominance technique, as beautifully demonstrated, of course, by Charles Manson, one of the world's more famous Scientologists.
Yes, completely. So back to your book. So you got out in 1984 and were briefly
October the 18th, 1983.
There we go. Okay, 83. Sorry, 74 to 83. Right.
That's it.
And so when did you tell me how what your path was to then embark on writing this book in the first place?
I think it was really down to meeting Captain Bill Robertson. That and for a couple of weeks, I believed the crazy nonsense that he was spreading around. I came to know him pretty well because he lived in East Grinstead for 8 months. And I always got on very well with him, but he was obviously out of his mind. And he couldn't understand. He watched me leave Scientology and kind of go, I don't want to do any. And he was so baffled that anybody could possibly want to do this. So it started with him because he arrived, and that's why October the 18th in my mind. 3 days before he was due to speak at the Grand Hotel in East Grinstead, a guy called Bevan Priest came to me, woke me up. I sleep late. I have a delayed sleep-wake phase. And I woke up with this guy standing by the bed saluting me and asking me if I'd host this meeting. And so I was obviously sleepy. So I said, yeah, all right. And I get to the meeting and I find out I've been appointed the chairman of the Operating Thetan Committee UK, which was brilliant. It's like, wow. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea that I'd been appointed this by Captain Bill Robertson, who was the second deputy commodore of Scientology. And therefore, with Hubbard out of the picture and Mary Sue out of the picture, he was technically the head of the Sea Organization, which is an interesting thought. And with him gone, I'm technically the head of Scientology now, I think. So if they'd like to transfer the bank accounts over now, we can start giving the money back. But so I host this meeting and find myself in the middle of this thing going, what happened? And I started a newsletter called Reconnection, most of which is available on some website. Isn't the internet wonderful? Around 33 issues. And
I haven't heard of that.
Well, there you go. Well, it's before your time, Claire.
Yes, very
you
much
were just
so.
a little whippersnapper when I did this. But it was really those of us who were disaffected, which was about half the membership internationally. There were There might have been as many as 40,000. I don't think it's ever gone much beyond that. And half of us left. And quite a lot of people just, that was it, them done with it. But some of us still had this fervor. We still believed that this was this wonderful world-saving medicine that was going to, liberate humanity. And so we invested ourselves absolutely and thoroughly in it. I was that person. I was making sure I was fighting, holding off the attacks from the mother cult against the independent groups. And we were among the first people to talk about independent Scientology back then. It was certainly the first ever public meeting in the UK of disaffected, about 60 of us there, I think.
Yeah.
But I started meeting people and talking to people. Captain Bill's the first one who had their stories to tell me. And Captain Bill, his story was that Ron Hubbard was dead. He was on the mothership and he was telepathically communicating with Bill,
Oh boy.
who wrote things down, which he called sector operations bulletins, SOBs. And they were handwritten. Wasn't it though? Sometimes the unconscious reflection does happen, the Freudian slip.
Right.
And these were handwritten. It looked exactly like Hubbard's handwriting, except for the capital A's. They weren't. But I couldn't. Who was this person? And they were signed Astar Parmegian. And I found, Bill then gave me a copy of Hubbard's script, or Suzette's reworking of Hubbard's Revolt in the Stars, which is the OT3 period is meant to be.
And Suzette being one of Hubbard's children.
That's right, Suzette Hubbard, one of the 7 children that he had by his 3 wives, and one of the 6 children who left Scientology.
Yes.
One way or another. And Revolt in the Stars was meant to be set around 75 million years ago, the evil galactic prince Xenu and all of this stuff. And in it, there's a character called Astar Parmegian. And Astar Parmegian is a nightclub singer who is in love with L. Ron L. Ray. And you can guess who L. Ron L. Ray might have been.
Yep.
And I later found out from Bill's girlfriend, who was a close friend of mine, who lived with him for 8 months, that he would take her to outside his clothing stores on a Saturday and point out the things he wanted. And then at 8 o'clock every evening, if he had nothing else to do, he'd put a ball gown on and high-heeled shoes. Now, Bill was 6'4" and big. He'd been a Mississippi motorcycle cop, I was told. And he would sing songs to L. Ron L. Ray. So he was my first, it's like I got what he said, and it was like, I don't think his explanation of what happened to Scientology is correct. And I started talking to people because I wanted to know. So the origin of the book is an article I wrote for the secondary connection that was called So What Really Happened, in which I tried to get how the Commodore's Messenger organization, David Miscavige, Pat Broker had taken over, how the Guardian's office had gone, how the mission holders conference had destroyed in a single blow this very prosperous and really the way that people were recruited into Scientology. It was just blown up.
Yeah. And
people were coming out, David Mayo's people were coming over, John Nelson, Harvey Haber, who both worked with Hubbard, and they were telling me stories. And it just, from there, it just became necessary to collect all of this together. And originally, I wrote a book called The Scientology War, which was about Captain Bill and his odd ideas. And then I realized nobody will understand this without understanding Scientology. So I then had to do a history of Scientology. And that was like, well, they're not going to get this without, because they're going to look at this and go, well, what kind of lunatic would believe this nonsense, frankly? So I had to put in my own story to say, well, I didn't know about Xenu and the body thetans until I've been involved for 7 years. It initially seemed like a practical form of therapy. I read Science of Survival to start with. And it just, you tried not to pay too much attention to things like History of Man, where Hubbard's, talking about us all being descended from clams and it being a cold-blooded and factual account of our last 60 trillion, 73 trillion, or 76 trillion years, according to which part of the book you're reading. I'm happy to say Miscavige has corrected it all to 76 trillion, but the first edition, Hubbard couldn't quite make up his mind about how many trillion years there have been, and that's a long time, given that we're in a universe that's only 14 billion years old. So trillions, that's very big.
Right.
And so I wrote lots of articles, and I started to look at all of the contradictions in Hubbard's own biographies. I collected 22 biographies that were copyrighted to Hubbard. So, you know, it is his responsibility. And I realized that no two of them were the same.
Yep.
And then along the way, quite early on, in fact, I saw work gathered by a journalist who called himself Michael Lynn Shannon. And years later, when Omar Garrison, who was the official biographer of Hubbard, when he was being harassed by Scientology and turned up on my doorstep to talk to me, he would not believe that I'd not had access to the Hubbard archive or interviewed Jerry Armstrong. But I hadn't. There was enough material available, and I got involved with other people who were researchers, and there was no World Wide Web. So if I needed something from the Montana Historical Society, I had to write them a letter. And it would, I got all of Hubbard's Navy records. I was the first person after he died to get the Navy, the FBI, the Veterans Administration records.
Wow.
And by that time, I was working with Russell Miller on his Barefaced Messiah. And Blue Sky was already pretty much done when Russell came along. He was probably the highest paid journalist in the UK. He was working at the Sunday Times, and they commissioned him to find Ron Hubbard. This was in January '86. And he came to me and said, well, you know, can I hire you as a researcher? Here's £2,000. It's like, oh, somebody wants to give me money for doing this. Incredible.
Yeah.
And because I just couldn't get a publisher, I'd written to 50 publishers. 11 of them came back and said they'd like to do the book, but they understood that the litigation would mean they couldn't make any profit from it.
Yeah.
Neville Spearman. Go ahead.
And sorry, what year was this?
The original, so it's January '86 is when Russell came to me, and I'd been putting a manuscript around for about 2 years then. So,
okay, so '84 to '86, and so when Russell came to you, you'd already had publishers even back then saying they didn't want to publish because of the litigious approach of Scientology to any such books.
Yes, and Neville Spearman, who ran Neville Spearman Publishers and had published The Mindbenders by Cyril Vosper. He wrote back to me a personal letter, and I got the idea of this guy in his 70s in his Savile Row suit with his public school accent writing back to me. And he explained it to me in the letter. He said, you know, I'd love to publish the book, but there is no money to be made. The Mindbenders sold 108,000 copies. And most of that money was lost in litigation.
Wow.
And he signed himself off Death to the Evil Cult, which was quite something. But I'd given up. I couldn't find a publisher. And so I gave Russell my manuscript.
I see.
And Barefaced Messiah, and I was his researcher through the whole 18 months of the project. I was his expert witness in '87 in the High Court in London. I don't know if anybody else along the way, you've probably been appointed an expert witness by now, haven't you? Yeah.
Yes, I testified in the Danny Masterson trial as an expert witness.
Yeah. And I think I was the first in '87.
Yes.
I don't think anybody had been before. And it was very interesting to be in that situation where you are considered, your expertise is valued by the court. You know, you've shown that you know enough about the subject that your opinion can be trusted. So you're not testifying to matters of your own experience. You're testifying based upon what you know about the subject. So we won those cases in Australia, in the US, and in England. But
And so,
about
sorry, so were those cases before Barefaced Messiah was published?
they were, yes, the attempt to injunct publication in Australia and England. In the US, strange things happened that the book was published and then it was withdrawn, even though Henry Holt, the publishers, had won the case. The judge had warned that because there was unpublished copyrighted material in the book, which had all come from me, Hubbard's diaries, his teenage diaries, letters that he'd written, guardian's orders that he'd authored. Every document that was questioned in the book had gone to Russell via me, including the infamous Skipper letter, the 1938 letter where Hubbard says he doesn't believe in immortality and his only goal is to smash his name into history. I'd been working with researchers and collectors, and there's just a most incredible treasure trove of particularly letters, like the 10th April 53 letter to Helen O'Brien, where he asks her what she thinks of the religion angle, which was a fairly straightforward admission on his part. And he says he needs
fairly deeply prophetic when you look at the subsequent where we are now. Holy moly.
Yeah. Isn't it though? And
yeah,
I mean, it's a whole other subject. As a Scientologist, I never thought of Scientology as a religion.
Me neither.
And it only became a big thing with people not being conscripted to go to Vietnam, and so they'd take a 1-week minister's course, and now they're exempt.
Right.
And I know that because I talked with people who'd successfully dodged the draft by doing this.
Yeah.
At the time,
and even then thereafter, it still wasn't positioned or discussed as a religion. At least in my experience growing up in it, I never considered it a religion until 1993 after the IRS exemption.
Yeah, and I mean, I got into a little bit of a barney with Janet Reitman when she was working on Inside Scientology, because she wrote to me and asked for my help, and I said, well, yeah, there are conditions. The first is you don't tell anybody I'm working with you because I've been steamrolled and I don't want to be harassed anymore. Yeah. And the second is a note that you call it the church, and it isn't.
Right.
And she came back with this great defense of, but there are people who are in it who believe it's a religion. And it's like, no, I'm not saying that. People believe it's a religion. That's up to them. It's not a church. A church, ecclesias, is a Christian organization. And that's why he used the word. And he's conned us all into using this per word, this friendly word to describe something that is really not Christian. And of course, it was registered by him in December 53 in Camden, New Jersey. I have the registrations, along with the Church of American Science, which is one of the little windows onto Hubbard's real intentions, because when John Sanborn put together Modern Management Technology Defined, because Hubbard never looked at the things he'd written, and John edited everything from 54 to 78, he found a definition of the Church of American Science, and it's in the book, where it says it's to recruit Christians and move them onto something better, meaning Scientology. So the word church, there was also the Church of Human Engineering. We still await the consequences of that particular church. It hasn't been activated yet.
Right.
So I'd written a book. I couldn't get it published. Russell had the manuscript. Since then, Russell gave it to Chris Owen. He gave all of his material to Chris Owen, and Chris gave all of his material to me. So I've got the original typescript that I gave to Russell, where Russell's crossed things out and he's taken chapter titles from me and he's taken whole sections. So probably about 50% of Barefaced Messiah came directly from me.
Wow.
But the other 50% is brilliant research on his part and his wife, Renata. So for example, his interview with Margaret Roberts, who was Hubbard's aunt. She's only 8 years old, was only 8 years older than him. From the age of 6 months to 12 years old, he lived in the same house as her. And so we had this precious interview with this woman who when she's asked, well, what about him being a blood brother with the Blackfoot Bikuni people? She says, I'm sorry, I've never heard of that. So then, I mean, the writing of the book was very much to, Russell was right. He's a biographer, an exceptional biographer. He's Conan Doyle is a really splendid book, but he wrote about Hefner and Getty, and so that's what he is. And so he wrote a biography. I wasn't seeking ever to write a biography. I was seeking to say, he says this here and he contradicts it here. Because if you want to get somebody to the point where they stop fanatically believing something, you have to use cognitive dissonance.
Right. Yes. No. And I will say, I love the quotes that you used at the beginning of the chapters, because it's such stark contrast. Obviously all of the quotes I'm familiar with, but just the way you laid it out, I thought was very, very good and very eye-opening.
Thank you.
Anyway, so carry on.
and that's also important. The sequence with which you give somebody information is vital. And I decided that for the most part, I would just follow a chronology.
Yeah.
So when the Dead Agent pack came out from Scientology, there were 60 points in it. And nearly all of them is sort of, he says that Scientology was banned in Victoria, Australia in fact, it was actually, and you say, yeah, it's chronological. That's when it was banned. If you read further, you'll find when the ban was lifted. All but there were 3 things of those 60 that weren't answered within the book itself. The other 57, they're all in the book. It's very poor work. Those 3 are all to do with Vicky Asnaran's statements, because she, of course, having made those statements, said that she perjured herself. And as I understand it, took an amount of money and went away.
Yeah.
And I decided that she was telling the truth in those statements. And if they wanted to sue me over that, we could deal with that then.
Fair enough. Okay, so we're up to January 86. You work with Russell Miller. So then what happens that your book does then finally get published?
Oh, somewhere in early 88, late 87, in fact, Russell called me up and said he was being followed by private detectives, and he was curious to know if they were the same private detectives who'd been harassing Lyle Stewart, the publisher who'd published Ben Corridan's L. Ron Hubbard, Messiah or Madman. And would I ask Lyle? Now, I didn't actually know Lyle, but it's fair enough, And Russell had done a story in China, he'd done a story in Mexico, he'd done a story in Germany, and there'd been private detectives following him. At great cost to the Scientology parishioners, no doubt.
No doubt.
And so I phoned Lyle Stewart up, and Lyle's first statement was, have you written a book about Scientology? I said, yes. And he said, I'll publish it. That was the beginning of the conversation. Nice. I later found out that anybody who phoned him up, he'd say, have you written a book about Scientology?
Oh, that's funny.
and he was a rogue. He was a guy who he published books about gambling, which was his favorite pursuit. He published books about the IRS, who were his favorite target. And he basically, ultimately, I didn't fare too well from the deal I made with him, but I don't think that was his fault. He came to England and we met in a hotel in London. He had the contracts and he said, I've sold the publishing company. I've sold it for $12 million to a group called Carroll Communications, but I'm still representing them. Here are your contracts. And I sign up. And that the guy who bought the company, Steve Schrager, he had no idea what he bought himself into. And of course, we're then sued before the book's published. Now, on the lead up to that, this guy, Dougie, came along driving a Rolls Royce with his initials on it, on the license plate, and said, I'm really rich and I want to help you publish this book about Scientology. this went on for about 6 months, and I very foolishly let him have a copy of the manuscript, and then I was sued. Now we tracked him down. He was a private detective. The Rolls-Royce was hired, just happened to have his initials on the license plate.
Wow.
And he managed to entrap Cyril Vosper in a kidnap deprogramming in Germany. And before he went off to Germany, Cyril told me that he was going to go off there and somebody was going to be kidnapped. And I said, you must not do that. This is a dreadful thing to do. And I would never and have never approved of such things. And it's utterly counterproductive and unnecessary. You know, you don't lock doors on people. You don't shut people up. You communicate with people. And
that's what Scientology does, is lock people up. And so definitely very different methods are absolutely required.
Yeah, and they've actually, of course, were convicted of kidnapping and deprogramming in the Guardian's Office 11 case. Mary Sue Hubbard admitted in her 217-page stipulation of evidence that she had ordered people to kidnap Michael Meisner, and that he was held, I think, for 6 months and all. But as you say, the Sea Organization, the amount of human trafficking, which is, of course, something that you were the first people to try and do something about that, you and Mark. And it is a reality that people are being trafficked, they're being enslaved, and you know that false imprisonment is the least of it. The Lisa McPherson case exemplifies. You know, she was not only kidnapped, she was tied down, and when she died, she had ligature marks on her wrists and on her ankles. Died of dehydration in the keeping of David Miscavige.
That's right.
So yeah, absolutely terrible. For me, free and open communication is the only way to go. There are no tricks, none of Hubbard's hypnotic methods, which is something. I mean, they're brilliant implanting of Scientology that you make somebody phobic about an idea. So psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, anything that has the word psyche at the beginning of it, you're phobic. You know, it's been you can't do that. I mean, Jesse Prince told me that he had a copy of Blue Sky for 6 years and didn't dare open the cover. And you kind of go, what's going to happen? Little demons are going to fly out and take. Oh no, that's Xena, you know.
I had the exact same. I did the same thing with Barefaced Messiah. I had it for about a year, 2 years, not 6 years, but you know, it's crazy that I thought I would be doing something that couldn't be undone. And finally, and this was in the very early days after I'd escaped from Scientology and was still very fearful of them. But finally, in my mind at that time, I thought to myself, well, Hubbard describes the quote multiple viewpoint system, in which you're supposed to be able to assess and hear multiple viewpoints. Like the scenario he gives, paraphrased, is when there's an accident, multiple different people see the accident, and each of their perspectives reflects what they saw, which might be different, but you can piece it all together. So I thought, well, what's wrong with reading a book?
I mean, as a Scientologist, I read Christopher Evans' Cults of Unreason. I read The Mindbenders by Vosper. But I remember a friend bringing a copy of Inside Scientology by Robert Kaufman. And we decided we'd hand it in because it said it had got the OT3 material in it. And you know, I later came to know Robert Kaufman, who was a fascinating and eccentric human being. But it was a very valuable book, I think. And that was something that became significant to me. It's like the idea of the suppressive person, that I shouldn't talk to these people because what are they going to do to me?
Right.
You know, and why would I? that's me admitting that I'm weak. When I interviewed John McMaster, the world's first real clear, as Hubbard named him to his own surprise, he said that when, because he's right there when the fair game doctrine is being written in 65, and he said he sat with Hubbard and he said, well, look, surely if there are these suppressive persons, we should seek them out and change them, transform them, because that will change the world. Why are we running away from them?
Yeah.
Why are we scared of them? And there is an answer to that, but the answer is, I don't think Hubbard ever gave it, but it's from Christian Science, where he gets certain of his ideas from. It's the idea of malicious animal magnetism. Now, animal magnetism is the term for hypnotism, or mesmerism, as it was also called. The idea that you can exert this mental power on people and they will fall under your spell. In earlier generations, it was called magic. It's just this idea of this strange force, this power that people can have. And the reality is that you have to be able to confront things, as Hubbard says. And
right. And as he alleges that his PTS-SP technology gives you the capacity to confront and shatter, quote unquote, suppression, right?
Suppression. Yeah.
Confront and shatter.
And I've had enough of it, because I had, a 16-year straight run of harassment pretty much on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And what became evident to me was that Scientologists were terrified of me.
Right.
I had a very interesting encounter with Ken Hoden when he was the port captain for Gilman Hot Springs.
I knew Ken very well.
He's the man who invented the word unconscionable, which he used in an interview with BBC Panorama. It's unconscionable what they've done with my religion. But, okay, unconscionable. That is a good one. That didn't see him in any more interviews after that, but they got Mike Rinder after that, who's a lot better on camera than Ken was.
For sure.
And you could almost believe him sometimes when he said
sometimes
things,
yeah, if you looked past the gaunt gray skin and the vacant eyes and the which I'm sure I looked the same way when I was there after years of not sleeping too, Yeah,
absolutely. And the primary method of control, as a former official at Guantanamo Bay said, sleep deprivation is the royal route to confession.
Yeah,
it's the principal method of brainwashing. You just don't let people sleep, and you can't focus or concentrate. Your memory doesn't function anymore. So terrible and sadly normal.
It is terrible. I witnessed that personally, where a staff member at Golden Era Productions actually was confessing to having burned down the film lab where Hubbard's films were made. It was completely untouched, unscathed, and anyway, it's awful. It's absolutely deplorable.
And it leads you into the truth rundown, this idea that you can confess to absolute and complete absurdity that's impossible, because Ron and David are always right, and whatever they say is true. Even if what they say is in complete contradiction to what else they say, it does get, really, really scary, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, where were we? I'm sure we were somewhere.
Yeah, so you were describing the events that led up to the publication of your book in 1990.
Yeah, so they got hold of the manuscript through Dougie, and they sued me in New York, and on the grounds that there was a precedent set by J.D. Salinger, the author of Catcher in the Rye. Salinger had sued a biographer for using quotations from letters that he'd written that were in a public collection. They were in a university collection. And he said, yes, but I could still profit by their publication. I could still make money by publishing them because I still own the copyright. There were cases very quickly in the Stravinsky estate and the Hemingway estate that followed on. And so you got this brief period of history in the US where you couldn't publish a hostile biography using unpublished material. So
interesting. So it's not that the premise was not that anything was incorrect. It was simply that they were letters.
Yes, and Guardian orders.
Unpublished being the key word. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there were 60 passages in the original manuscript. And that book is called A Piece of Blue Sky, the original book. The reason when I took it back and republished it, we renamed it Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which is the full statement made by Ron Hubbard when he opened the doors in April 1950 to the first Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He turned to Don Rogers, who I interviewed, and said, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky. What he was talking about, in fact, was we'll sell them meaningless memberships. We'll call them patrons meritorious, or gold this, or diamond that, and they'll give us money for this, which they did.
History repeats itself, right?
It's a fundamental aspect of Scientology, yeah, the sale of status, you know, so that you're now an OT8. What can you actually do? I can complain.
Yeah. I can move objects with my mind. I just cannot ever show anybody that I can do that. I've always had the perspective. It's one of the most elaborate examples of the Emperor's New Clothes scenario that exists on this planet.
Absolutely, Natalie. I mean, probably have a copy. Yeah, I keep a copy of it. So I only keep 2 Scientology books here, so that I can refer to them at will. And this is an actual Scientology publication, just so that we're clear on that.
Yep, Scientology 08.
Yep. Now
08, 0 to 8. Yep.
0 to infinity.
Right.
Which will make the physical universe into nothing, and we will make you infinite instead of you being nothing. And there is a very interesting little trap underneath that concept. The first axiom of Scientology: life is basically a static, which has no mass, no motion, no meaning, no location in space or in time. You've just been defined. You are nothing.
Good point.
You are the life static. You're the Thetan. But here we have this passage. This is the 1970 edition. You won't find this in any of the later editions, because they realized that it might legally get them into trouble. But Operating Thetan, OT course section 8, capital letters, description: ability to be at cause knowingly and at will over thought, life, form, matter, energy, space and time, subjective and objective. So if you want to make things disappear and appear, you can do it.
Yep.
Objective, not just subjective. You will have the ultimate superpowers. Doesn't seem to have happened. And usually when you ask, it's like they'll tell you they can change traffic lights and move clouds.
Right. Exactly.
So what I used to do
and anticipate phone calls.
Anticipate phone calls. The phone will ring sometime. Absolutely brilliant. So I used to do this little thing, which was the presumption that I must, if I speak publicly, there will be exterior Scientologists watching me, of course, inevitably, because they've got to monitor my progress. And so what I used to do is put a little bit of tinfoil on the table and say, if this tinfoil moves just 1 inch during the course of the talk, then we all know that Scientology works. Never moved.
There you go.
Moving clouds, you change traffic lights. Oh, come on. So it's just hokum. And Emperor's New Clothes, this thought that from February 1952 onward, when he started promising, I mean, in 1950, he's promising you'll be immune to viruses. You'll never catch a cold again. That's a good one. You'll have a perfect memory. And of course, that didn't really work. And you'll be emotionally, cheery at all times.
Right.
When
Perfect. Perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And there were 272 people that this had already been done to, according to Modern Science and Mental Health, none of whom has ever come forward. Not one.
Yep.
And when, of course, Sonia Bianca, the Clear, did appear at the Shrine Auditorium in August 1950, she couldn't remember the colour of his tie when he turned his back, let alone the physics formulae from her degree. So,
right.
Yeah. But he then went on to promise these supernatural abilities. And as yet, how on earth did he manage to do this? That people would keep on believing him up until, well, now, and pay out hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars for the promise. And there are answers to that question, and I say I'm writing a book about that at the moment. That this has happened throughout history. This, Hubbard said that his favourite book was 12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho, and it's always surprised me that kind of go, look, this is Ron Hubbard's favourite book. You going to read it? Oh no, we wouldn't do that. I think if it's his favourite book, he should probably read it. One of the 12 people in there is Cagliostro, who is one of the greatest con men in all history. He went around the crown princes of Europe scamming them, and he is the very model for Hubbard. This is his favourite book, absolutely his favourite book.
Very telling.
Yeah, as indeed are many of his other favourite books, like Hypnotism Comes of Age by Wolf and Rosenthal. If you want to understand Scientology, that's a pretty good one. Yeah. He'll make these casual references, or Aleister Crowley, of course. He tells you to read Aleister Crowley, and I did. And I found tens of things that became part of Scientology, including the birth engram. That comes directly from Crowley.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think you and I have ever talked about this, but I'm sure you've heard of Bonnie View, the home that was that exists at the headquarters in
Jerry Armstrong was putting visqueen linings into it when the 22 boxes of Hubbard material were,
Yes. And of course that was renovated at a cost of, I think it was $30-some million in the early 2000s. But what was fascinating to me at that time is that L. Ron Hubbard's personal library, which was some 2,000 books, was replicated, and every one of those books had to be purchased and put into that home. And that list of books, I'm confirming what you're saying. Every single significant text, and other ones not significant too, were absolutely on that list. And it was fascinating to me that as someone born in Scientology, I would never consider reading Freud or any of these many people that Hubbard even references in his lectures and books and materials, but we would never be allowed to read those ourselves.
Anyway. Yeah, I mean, two points on that he, of course, makes the one claim, which is that nobody contributed anything major, and that his, in Fundamentals of Thought, he says that his is the first discovery in 50,000 years. And that makes me wondering, well, what was it that was found 50,000 years ago that was so important,
Great question.
We'll never know now.
No, we won't. Then he's certainly not coming back. He's long since missing in action at this point.
Oh, yeah, and who can blame him, given what might happen to him if we caught him?
Right.
But then you have these lists of people, like in 8008, that he's beholden to. Yeah. And Freud pops up a number of times. So he talks about Commander Thompson, who, when he was 12 years old, he learned the Freudian mysteries from somebody who'd studied with Freud. Commander Thompson didn't study with Freud. He did send Freud a postcard once. There's a postcard in the Freud archive from Commander Thompson. Russell Miller found the log of a ship that went through the Panama Canal in 1923, and Ron Hubbard and Commander Thompson were aboard that ship. So it's very likely he did meet him. I don't think he learned much about the Freudian mysteries, having read his diaries when he was 15 and 16. He just seems like a kid. He really wasn't thinking deep thoughts.
Right.
The only trouble with China is there are too many chinks there. They could use the Great Wall as a roller coaster. And his only comment about mysticism, having said he'd studied with gurus in China, India, Tibet, and Mongolia. The only comment in his handwritten diaries is that he visited a lamasery and the monks sounded like bullfrogs. That's it.
Oh boy.
But with Freud, there is that clue. And there are a series of lectures given before the First World War in Worcester, Massachusetts by Freud. And in one of them, he describes the Dianetic method. He's got counting back. He's got the flickering of the eyelids. He's got charge, emotional charge. He's got the engram. Doesn't use the word, but he says that this, where Hubbard, so we see he didn't understand the unconsciousness of the pain stuff. No, he's got that too. You've pretty much got the method. And then Freud explains why you don't use it. And that's because it makes the person more dependent, not less dependent on the therapist.
Makes sense.
And, well, I believe that Freud was an utter and total con artist. It's been one of my studies over the years, but Frederick Crew's book about Freud is exceptional. And you find him stealing ideas from people. He's, when I left Scientology, I went, well, Hubbard credits Freud, I'd better read some Freud. And I can remember reading the first paragraph of a Freud lecture and going, this is just like Hubbard. This is a guy who's narcissistic, he's boasting, and he's paranoid. Everybody's out to get me. It's sort of, oh, this is the same kind of temperament.
Interesting.
But nonetheless, you have this original thesis, you might call it, which would be turned into Dianetics.
Yeah.
I mean, a similar method was used. There was a hypnotist called William Brown, who's famous because when Agatha Christie went missing, and the largest manhunt in British history was to try and find her, when she turned up and said, I don't know what happened, I have amnesia, she saw this guy, William Brown, and he used methods in the 1930s that are strangely similar to Hubbard's approach in 1950. But yeah, so this idea, that was a lot of, the research to do Blue Sky. I had to get into all sorts of archives. There are, I was one of the people who was interviewed for a book called Religion Inc. by a guy called Stuart Lamont, and he interviewed 5 of us to write a book. When I checked through Blue Sky, there is material from 150 people.
Wow.
But most of the material comes from Hubbard.
Yeah.
As you've seen in reading it, it's just, you don't have to make anything up. You're just like,
no.
Well, he was 2 years old, 4 years old, or 6 years old when he became a blood brother of the Blackfoot people. I was in a deposition with Kendrick Moxon, Toxic Moxon, one of the 38 unindicted co-conspirators, along with Ron Hubbard in the Mary Sue case.
Yes.
And I had a couple of interesting days with him in this deposition, and he pushed this thing across. He said, you say that Ron Hubbard was not a blood brother of the Blackfoot. Here is a letter on the letterhead of the Blackfoot people by a member of the tribal council saying that he was. And I didn't even look at it. I said, it's Tree Many Feathers, isn't it? And he wasn't a member of the tribal council. And he pulled the thing back and looked and went, oh, no, he's not on the letterhead. Tree Many Feathers, if you look to the Los Angeles Times of June 1990, he's interviewed and he says, I'm an 8th blood Bakun. I found out that there were no records. So I had a ceremony and made him a blood brother.
Wow.
Kind of going to 2 or 3 points there that the tribal historian said we'd never made a blood brother. And the deputy chief of the tribe said, there's no such thing. And indeed, I don't believe any Native American group have ever made a blood brother.
Yeah.
It's a Viking myth that Hollywood imported in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah.
But Hubbard quite liked the idea, evidently. And you kind of go, so they made you a full-blood brave at the age of 2. That is a little fanciful, isn't it? That one completely. I did trace down. And this was the nature of the research, to try and find out anything and everything. Every story he told has some tiny little grain of truth in it. So what was the connection with the Blackfoot people? His aunt, as I say, Margaret Roberts, said, never heard of them. Don't know what that's about. I got a map. He gets the date wrong. I think he calls it the 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's actually 1911, or it's the other way around. One suddenly arrived in a bookshop in East Grinstead, 38 volumes for £5. The one he'd used. In that Britannica, there is a map of the reservations of the Picun people. And you see that the train line that took him from his place of birth, Tilden, Nebraska, at 6 months old, through to Helena, Montana, goes through a Blackfoot reservation.
Oh my gosh. Then that's the sliver of truth?
Yeah,
wow.
That there were Blackfoot people begging on the station. By this time they'd been completely and absolutely devastated.
Yeah.
And so I imagine that his mum told him something about how they were on the station there, and he fabricated this story. I mean, looking at his teenage diaries and how he studied with gurus in the East, and then seeing what actually happened. I think there's a Dianetic axiom where he basically says there is no such thing as creativity. That you're always working with something that's happened and changing and expanding it. And no, I don't think so. I think there are people who've brought new things into the world.
Absolutely.
But he was describing his own process.
Right.
Which was that he just stole ideas from people and expanded them. And you look at any of the things he did, like the Alaskan radio experimental expedition, where what actually happened, and there's a book published by Scientology of photographs of Ketchikan, Alaska.
Yep.
And it shows you that what the expedition was him spending 6 months stranded in Ketchikan, appearing on the radio station there where he was much loved, and not actually doing any hydrographic charting or anything of that type, because his ketch, the boat, the magician, had broken down. And so he sat there, and that becomes that story. And you look at, I analyzed all of the claims that he made, the Caribbean motion picture expedition. And that one was freaky because the denials of the success of that are articles written by Hubbard at the time. So he's saying, oh, we didn't achieve anything. Didn't have any pirate battles at all, which is what they'd been meant to be doing. But we did provide valuable research for the US Hydrographic Department. So
sure. Fascinating. Well, thank you for all of your amazing, extensive research into all of this. And I absolutely have been thoroughly enjoying rereading your book. And it certainly helped me to unravel things when I first read it 14 years ago. So I did want to comment before we wrap up. I found it interesting. I'd forgotten this, but I've been asked before if our paths crossed, which, I was 7 at the 7 years old or 7 or 8 when you got out of Scientology. So not much path crossing at St. Hill. But I found it interesting that actually you were at Manchester Org when both of my parents were there working as staff in the late 70s. Interesting.
What's your maiden name?
Ward. Yeah. So
and your parents' first names?
Graham and Jen. Gen.
Yeah, I remember Jen Ward. I remember the name. So.
Yeah. Crazy, right? Small world. Anyway, one last question for you before we wrap up, and I would love to do more with you because your wealth of knowledge is just stunning. What would you tell a Scientologist or a current under the radar Scientologist to encourage them to read this book?
I don't even think it's the right book to read. I think that it might be too frightening. So my approach would be more to parallel and to show the person something that's not threatening. So Scientology is not mentioned in it at all. And there are a number of very, in fact, there are a lot of very good ex-member accounts from groups. Perhaps Sarah Edmondson's book about her experience with NXIVM.
Yes.
Um,
I'll be interviewing Sarah next week, interestingly enough, that you mentioned that.
give her my regards.
I will. I absolutely will.
It's a while since we last spoke, but also, you know, looking at it's sort of understanding that this is about us being human. It's not about there being anything special about any particular group.
Yeah.
All of the groups use the same techniques. Scientology uses nearly all of them.
Yeah.
You know, so if you went to transcendental meditation, and I did a lot of research on them, and there are a couple of videos on my channel with Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly, who are deeply experienced in transcendental meditation. And I take it, it's a negative group. I do not have a positive feeling about it at all.
Yeah.
But they're, and looking at things like that, videos about things, but with transcendental meditation, you've got two techniques. You know, you've got repeating the name of a demon or deity over and over again until your head wobbles. Not a form of meditation that I recommend. I think anything that induces an altered state in that way is actually harmful.
Yeah.
Even though it can blank out the anxiety you're feeling about other things. I think meditation should be a focusing of attention, not a blowing away of attention.
Right.
I recommend the use of music personally. I think you need something that's moving rather than staring at things. So some nice gentle music, bit of Renaissance polyphony or a little bit of Indian classical music. But I think meditation is a good idea. But you've got that technique, or you've got the levitation technique of TM. I interviewed a woman when I was researching a book on TM, which I didn't do in the end, who had fractured her coccyx by doing that, which is an awfully painful thing to do and will be painful for the rest of your life. Transcendental meditation paid her somewhere over $100,000 not to talk about it anymore. When I first met Pat Ryan back in '91, he had tunnel vision from all the meditation he'd done. You know, and I was very happy. I didn't see him for years. Very happy the next time I saw him that had now changed. But you have to be careful with these things. But just two techniques. Scientology actively has more than 2,000 techniques.
Right.
And
crazy.
If you start from the beginning and work on up, there might be as many as 10,000.
Right.
And one of the implants that Scientology uses is to frighten you about the idea of hypnotism.
Yep.
This is not hypnotism. Well, of course, Hubbard does admit that it is hypnotism. In Science of Survival, he cancels the technique used for Dianetics because it's hypnotic. You'll see a fluttering of the eyelids. This is a sign of somebody going into the very lightest level of trance, Hubbard says, in 1951. Then it's brought back in 1977.
Interesting.
With the book one, that Hubbard Dianetic Auditors course. So, yeah, I mean, let me think about it, and I'll think about some other particular recommendations. I think video is very good. Watching again with NXIVM, Seduced or The Vow. Some of the material about Rajneesh, because if people think that, you know, if you're going to their confirmation bias, their my side bias, so you're questioning what they believe in, there's resistance immediately. Whereas if you're sort of going, well, these are things that people do. And I mean, my practice from the very beginning, I'm not interested in converting anybody or deconverting anybody. I've never sat down with the intention of getting somebody to leave Scientology or leave the beliefs of Scientology. I always sit down with the perspective of, I want this person to have more and better information that they can check and verify. And more control over their own thinking. Because the problem is, and it happens in all cultures and at all times, that we think within the constraints that are laid upon us. And to be independent in our thinking is extremely difficult. To become, to develop a healthy skepticism about all things, be willing to, agreeably challenge anything and everything. So, I find that I have robust and good conversations with people of all sorts of belief. I was visiting a friend this week who's a theologian, and I don't believe what he believes, and he doesn't believe what I believe, except that we both believe that we should be compassionate, that we should be decent in our behavior towards other people, and that it's okay for us to talk about anything. My friend Christian Shirko is also a theologian, and we've known each other since 1987. We've never had a disagreement, and I have challenged and questioned ideas in the New Testament with him, and he's very happy to talk about it. And
nice,
which is the place we ought to get to. That Robert Thewles, pretty much the inventor of critical thinking, and also a significant member of the British Society for Psychical Research in the 1970s. So there you go. But Thewles said, if somebody gets upset while they're talking about something, they're not rational.
Yeah.
And, so that thing of not upsetting people and giving them something that's helpful to help them expand the way they think. Maybe, I'm looking at it right now. So the compilation of work from Robert J. Lifton called Losing Reality. That is an excellent book. And Lifton is one of the most important thinkers of the generation. He's still alive, aged nearly 100.
Wow.
And his work on thought reform in China, showing that there are these 8 paths. We've mentioned loaded language, language that confines your thinking. He was interested to see that as in the late 70s, the counter-cult world developed, that his ideas were being used to say, well, this is what these groups do. So I think looking at things like the cult of confession within that, in terms of, so for somebody who's leaving, or to help somebody to leave, giving them material that shows that there are such things in the world. Once they've left, yes, blue sky.
Yes, for sure.
And Barefaced Messiah.
Yes, 100%.
And probably Mark's book as well, because it's the funniest book about Scientology.
Yes. And to wrap up, as we discussed at the beginning, I will have 4 copies of A Piece of Blue Sky. Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky signed by yourself. Thank you so much for that agreement. And so for anyone who's watching this video, we just ask that you comment, ask any questions you'd like for future discussions. And I will be giving those out to this community because there's a lot of amazing people interested in this topic and who could benefit from reading the book, I think.
Yeah. And if you want to explain Scientology to somebody who's never been involved in it, I wrote a little book called Scientology Cult of Greed.
Yes.
And it's just the bullet points, but you've got the act, where 1947, where L. Ron Hubbard asks for psychiatric treatment, the letter is reprinted in the book. So you can see his own words about his suicidal inclinations and how messed up he was at the very moment that he's claiming to have developed this technique.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, as always, Jon. It's been a very interesting, fascinating conversation for me as well. So I always learn new things when talking with you. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.